All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about sine and cosine. Last lesson, we talked about tangent. The steps to solving the problems are the same, but the ratios are going to change. That's the only difference between sine, cosine, and tangent. So again, remember, sine is opposite over hypotenuse, and cosine is going to be adjacent over hypotenuse. So if we look at this problem here, they want the ratios, and so the answer needs to be written in a fraction. So if we want the sine of x in this problem, remember, this is the angle that we're referencing, that we're starting from, and we shoot the arrow and this becomes opposite. So for sine, do we need opposite? We do, and that value is going to go on top. So 64 will go on top. We also need the hypotenuse, and if you remember from the last lesson, the hypotenuse we can find by taking an arrow from the 90-degree angle and shooting it across. So in this case, we'd have 64 over 80. Now with the calculators I recommend you guys get, if you type that in, you'll get this as an answer. It'll simplify the fraction for you, which makes it really nice. So the answer to this would be 4 over 5. Okay. All right, now if we did for y, if we start from angle y, 48 would become opposite because we shoot the arrow across. 80 would become our hypotenuse, and when we simplify that, it becomes 3 over 5. Okay. All right, if we did cosine now, cosine of x, remember this is opposite, but for cosine we don't need opposite, we need adjacent. So this becomes the adjacent side, this becomes the hypotenuse, which is why we get 48 over 80. For cosine of y, we have adjacent and we have hypotenuse, which is why we get 64 over 80. So again, you have to know how to identify opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. All right, so now we want to find missing side lengths. So in this case, let's find DF in this problem. So based on this angle, DF is opposite, and this is the hypotenuse. So which one would we use? We're going to use sine. And so we would set it up, sine of the angle is equal to opposite. In this case, I wrote it as side length DF, but you could use x if you wanted to, over 8. So opposite over hypotenuse. Now remember, if the variable's on top, what do? We cross multiply. So in the calculator, 8 times sine of 20, and you should get a value about 2.7. Okay. All right, over here we want to find ST in this case. So based on this angle, this would be opposite, this would be hypotenuse. So our fraction would be sine of the angle is equal to 10 over ST. Again, I know some of you are thinking, how do I know to use sine? Well, it's because we're given the opposite and we want to find the hypotenuse. So we have O and H that we're dealing with, and so that's why we use sine. All right, now what happens when the variable's on bottom? Oops, that was a mistake. When the variable's on the bottom, what do? We are going to switch these two and divide. So you should have 10 divided by sine of 50, and then you should get an answer approximately about 13.1. Okay, so when the variable's on the bottom, we switch the variable with the trig function, the sine, cosine, or tangent, and divide. All right, so let's look at a couple problems here and see. Now notice in this, none of it tells you to use sine, cosine, or tangent. This is why it's so important to understand opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So in this problem, if we want to find x, for example, based on the angle, x would be opposite, and we're given hypotenuse. So to find x, we would do this. And if the variable's on top, what do? We cross multiply, so 25 times sine of 57. To find y in this case, we would use cosine to find y. All right, over here, we shoot the arrow. This would become opposite. This is hypotenuse, so we're going to use sine. Here's the work for y in this example. So over here, we have cosine, and the variable's on top, so we cross multiply, and you should get a value about 16.4. Okay. All right, down here, here's the flagpole. They know how long the wire is, and they know the angle measure, because that could be measured, and they want to know how high the flagpole actually is. So in this case, are going to be our x, and this would be the opposite side of the angle, but we don't need it, and so we're going to use cosine. So in this case, cosine, the variable's on top, so we're going to cross multiply. So 20 times cosine of 35 is going to be 16.4. All right, a couple more. Now we want to find the angle, and if you remember to find the angle, we need that -1 button. So depending on what's given, we'll use sine -1 today or cosine -1. So based on x, this would be opposite, this would be hypotenuse, so we're going to use sine. And so in order to get the angle, we're going to do sine -1 of that fraction, and we should get a value close to 41 degrees.